Welcome everyone to the Yogic Studies podcast. I'm your host, Seth Powell, and this is episode 28. Thank you so much for listening, and for those of you who are viewing on YouTube. For our long-term Yogic Studies podcast listeners, I just want to remind you that we're now turning video on for these podcasts, and you can actually view and watch these conversations on our Yogic Studies YouTube channel. I also want to just take a moment here before we get started to just say thank you to all of our listeners and supporters over the last year or so that the Yogic Studies podcast has been running. It's been an incredible ride, and I'm so grateful for all of the support, the comments, the feedback that we've been getting. So thank you so much, especially those of you who've taken the time to leave a review on iTunes. You can also now like and comment on these episodes on our YouTube channel, and that feedback really helps support and grow the podcast. So thank you so much. And let's get to today's conversation, which I'm very excited about, to welcome our guest, Dr. Keith Cantú, who is assistant professor and postdoctoral research associate at Jagiellonian University in Kraków, Poland. Although he's not in Krakow currently, Keith, welcome to the Yogic Studies podcast. How are you doing? Where are you coming from tonight?
Thanks for having me, Seth. So I'm under a remote contract. So I'm currently in the center of Los Angeles, near Koreatown and Little Bangladesh.
Well, that's sort of perfectly fitting for you, as our listeners, our viewers will learn. Well, Keith, this has been a long time coming. We've known each other now for quite a while. I mean, really as long as I've been a grad student, I can say. We go back, I think it's almost 10 years now, because I started my master's at the University of Washington in 2012. And it's almost 2022. So we've been going back and forth and doing this for a long time. Somehow you raced ahead of me and you finished your PhD. So much respect and congratulations, first off, on finishing your dissertation. We'll definitely get into that rich topic. But to kind of get us started here today, I want to hear, a little bit about your story and your background. So I first heard of you, actually, learned your name when I was applying to grad school at the University of Washington, UW in Seattle. An old friend of mine, Jason Melrose, who was already in the program, he was kind of, convincing me to apply there. We had done our undergrad together at HSU up in Humboldt. And I think I was just asking about the program and who, some of the grad students were in there. And he was like, yeah, there's this guy, Keith, here. You're going to love him. And he's like, he has this incredible story. Before he came into the program, he had been traveling and living in India, and he bought a rickshaw in South India, and he drove all over the subcontinent in a rickshaw, picking up hitchhikers, playing music, discovering yogis and Bauls and fakirs. And I just was like, who are you? And this is incredible. And I knew we just had so much in common, because I had just been coming from India, actually. Right before that, I had been on this journey traveling, and so I knew we had a lot in common. But tell me a little bit about your background then, and like what led you to, pursue a degree in comparative religion, South Asian studies, for us to cross paths as MA students.
Definitely. Well, you met me at a really unique turning point in my life. I mean, at University of Washington, I had originally applied because they had this international studies MA, but the branch of it was comparative religion, and I was conflicted. How do I both pursue an interest in these religious topics that I had sort of gathered in Bangladesh and combine that with a fellowship that I had had, as well as sort of a career path, I guess more generally, that I was pursuing at that time to go into the Foreign Service and work for the State Department and basically pursue a career in international politics. And after graduating from college, I had this Fulbright fellowship to teach and research in Bangladesh, which I was able to use to defer this career path for a year. And going to Bangladesh, which, as you noted, originally how I got to Bangladesh was by purchasing a rickshaw in South India and driving it from Chennai to, I was trying to get into Dhaka, but they wouldn't let me cross the border without a special passage, like some kind of card of passage. So I ended up.
What gave you the idea to just go buy a rickshaw? Like, most people would not think to do that. They're like, oh, I'll take the train. Today you can fly domestically in India so easily. This was a little while ago, but still, it's pretty adventurous.
It's true. It's true. I was inspired by these, there were these adventure trips that people, were paying a lot of money to go on these adventure trips on rickshaw tours. But I was like, you know what? I'm familiar with India a little bit. I had traveled and backpacked before. Let me just try doing it on my own and seeing where it takes me. And yeah, it was a really incredible experience meeting people on the road and sleeping in kind of villages, being welcomed by different communities and kind of seeing people's reactions. And yeah, I really learned a lot from that experience. But it was really just the prelude to a wider transformative year in Bangladesh, teaching and researching and yes, encountering, communities of sadhus and they wouldn't call themselves yogis, but, as we'll see in the course, there's a strong connection with some of these practices, Bauls and some of the Hindu Shaiva and Shakta Tantrikas as well, and their tradition of yoga. So, it was really a transformative experience that convinced me, hey, I need to rethink where I'm going in life. Maybe I should take this kind of academia thing seriously. So, yeah. So
you had already had some training then in Bangla, in the language of Bangladesh, before you went there? And then did that continue formally when you were there?
We had been awarded a 3-month intensive training program on arrival. So I had done some independent study. I think I had like a Teach Yourself Bangla book a little bit, but other than that, I had zero experience until I arrived there, and I was sort of thrown into this deep environment of just kind of, it was a very immersive program in time. Yeah.
One of the things I've always been impressed with you is your ability to study all of these languages. Like we studied Sanskrit together in the early days, but you were already basically fluent in Bangla, and you had studied some Hindi. Later, as we'll learn, you also studied Tamil as it pertained to your dissertation work. But do you think you've kind of always had a knack for languages, or is it something that you've really struggled with, or how was this kind of immersive experience in Bangladesh? Like, how did that shape your language training?
Yeah, I'll be honest, at first I didn't think I really had too much of a talent for language. I grew up, my grandparents spoke fluent Spanish, so I grew up around Spanish hearing it, but I never could really speak it fluently. And, I studied French in college, but, it wasn't the kind of immersive experience. I wasn't sure that I really had any kind of talent for language. But in going to Bangladesh and sort of, really tuning into the environment, and a word that they use there, bhab, from Sanskrit bhava. And there's sort of just a bhab, or an environment, a poribesh, where you just are sort of, able to connect with people and have language kind of all around you. And especially in the kinds of environments where English is not so prevalent, that's where, I was able to connect and kind of be forced to really step up and interact with the language in the modes that interested me. So I was interested, in, okay, well, what is sadhana, for example, in Bengali sadhon, I'm interested in that, so talk to me about it, or I'm interested in this song, this music, what are the words, what's the meaning? And so in order to pursue that interest, it led to a whole host of other kind of forms of linguistic data, for lack of a better word, that I had to learn first, right? To get to the point where I wanted to go, I had to learn some of these basics, and I was just confronted with it on a daily basis. Yeah.
So before we met, I had heard of the Bauls before. They had come up a little bit in my studies of Hatha Yoga and kind of interactions between different religious and sadhu groups in medieval and pre-modern India, the Naths, the Sufis, and sometimes, different forms of Tantra, and sometimes you'd hear about these Bauls of Bengal. Mm-hmm. But I never really knew too much about it. It was kind of always something that was brought up. It was cursory. To this day, actually, still, it's an area I would like to study more that I don't, it's not my expertise, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I know in your travels, like this community, you really went very deep, immersing yourself with this tradition, with some living teachers, masters, singers, practitioners. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about the Baul tradition and kind of your exposure to it.
Yeah, the Bauls are a really unique case because I think that as they survive today, they're sort of divided between West Bengal in India and Bangladesh today. And so I think that the tradition as it exists today is really interesting since we have this legacy of partition that kind of separates two sides, and there is communication between the India side and the Bangladesh side. But by and large, there's sort of two, I would say, interacting and overlapping identities of Bauls and then fakirs. And fakirs kind of tend to have more of a Sufi Islamic bent to them, even though a lot of them do not identify as Muslim particular. And then the Baul side, often has more of like a Hindu base or sort of foundation. But as you probably have heard, in your understanding of Bauls, they really overlap. And the point is to kind of give some kind of common denominator to what makes us human. And so you have in these songs all of these blending, conceptual blending of different themes from Vaishnava, from Shakta, Tantra, even some references from Buddhism, and you have it blended with, references from Sufism and kind of ideas that pertain to the yogic body, or the subtle body that you would be familiar of in your audience in yoga. And so, you have kind of a wealth of symbols on the one hand, and I would say the main current in which Baul teachings or Fakiri teachings are spread is through music and through song. So there's a whole performance base to this as well, and there's a whole kind of social structure around how these songs are communicated from guru to student, or in the case of Sufis, murshid, which is kind of a word that's used synonymously with guru. So you have kind of a whole system in place for the transmission of these songs, but then on the other hand, they're also popular. Right? So you have, a popular culture accessing them as sort of important elements of Bengali, national culture, identity, all kinds of things like that as well. So, yeah.
Right, because the tradition and the songs, the poetry, it's in the vernacular, as we say. It's in the language of the people, right? It's not in Sanskrit or classical Tamil or something like that.
Sure.
And so that kind of, and you mentioned the kind of public performance, the performative nature of it. Tell us a little bit about that. Like, I know there's this tradition of traveling and wandering performers, sadhu performers, and you've gotten to experience that a bit. What does that look like? I'm thinking like traditionally, well, and we're gonna problematize these words traditionally, originally, classically. I think we'll get into that, but let's keep it simple. What does that look like today? that tradition?
Yeah, so I think since the poet Rabindranath Tagore came on the scene, there has been a tendency to view Bauls as this kind of wandering minstrel. And it's interesting, I know Hugh Urban has an article about this, the construction of the Baul image in, Bhadralok, or sort of, among the gentlefolk, kind of the upper middle to upper class society. There is a construction of this image, but it's problematic, but there's also kind of a half-truth to it, and that many of these Bauls and artists, they live on the margins of different social structures, of religions, but at the same time, they're traveling from, they use the word akra, so akra for a place like a hermitage where they perform their practices, akra or ashram, depending on the word that's used, and they'll travel from different akras and different societies to learn songs and to participate in Onushthan, which is from Sanskrit anushtanas. So these are actually the events that happen in which a performance takes place. And so there's a lot of travel that goes into the culture. But at the same time, we have to be careful, because there are also Bauls and fakirs who stay put and who sort of really don't leave the akra setting that much, except to maybe, perform songs or meet with students or things like that. So,
how does it compare to other like kirtan or bhajan traditions in other parts of India? Like I'm thinking of Maharashtra, and thinking of the work of one of our professors from UW, Christian Levetsky, and his work on kirtan and Namdev's performative devotional songs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there is a level to which bhakti, right, interacts with sort of the public perceptions and interacts with kind of a wide variety of social strata, different classes of people. It can be a political and economic force as well to some degree. But I think in the case of the Bauls, what's interesting is that there is a push to, I would say, travel and connect the dots between Bangladesh and Ajmer in Rajasthan. So there is kind of a comparative thread, or like a historical thread, that you can draw. And so many of the Baul singers who I met with knew about the Chishti Sufi order and bhakti as it takes place in Ajmer in Rajasthan. And they knew about kind of, the wider public perceptions about bhakti in sort of North India, outside Bangladesh and West Bengal. But they're not so aware of the political or economic ramifications of that, or the significance of that. They're not so aware, for the most part, in conversations that I've had, of the academic significance or construction of bhakti as a category of music, of song outside. It's sort of just what people do. They gather together and sing the songs and, have the onushtans, and, that's kind of just a natural element of the culture that kind of spontaneously arises, if that makes sense.
Mm.
Yeah.
And then, what would you say? You mentioned earlier they don't necessarily identify as yogis, although some of them are living this more sadhu, even renunciate lifestyle, practicing various bodily and mental rituals and devotional practices. But at the same time, yoga does feature within the Baul tradition, within their so tell us, actually. So the question is, what is the role of yoga? How do they view yoga within this tradition?
It's a great question. So I have a forthcoming chapter in a volume edited by Kerala Loria and Rohit Singh on ethnography of Tantra. And in this chapter, I'm kind of going into a little bit of interviews and sort of, discussions that I've had with, practitioners about some of these questions, like what does the word yoga mean to you? What does the word Tantra mean to you? And one of the things that came up with yoga that's interesting is that The immediate translation or sort of relationship of Sanskrit word yoga to Bengali is jog. And jog can mean addition, it can mean a conjunction, like an astrological conjunction, but it can also mean kind of just a union or a binding of two things. And so when yoga comes up, and I talk about jog or jog sadhan, yoga sadhana, what really comes up is the specific sexual practices between a male and female. So it's a very embodied idea of what yoga sadhana is. And it's not so much, you know better than I, the formulation of the postures that might make that possible in terms of yoga. For that, they'd use the word BAM, exercise, and so there is a physical component to how that jog sadhan works, but it specifically relates to these embodied practices between two individuals.
So it's very much a householder tradition.
Yeah. I mean, there's a division between different camps of Baul fakirs, some of which really celebrate these practices of jog sadhana, and some of which sort of, claim that, well, it's better overall to be celibate for the most part. And then other camps do claim that, well, if you're celibate, how are you experiencing these symbols and these ideas that are happening in the songs? So there's just two camps.
In your research, have you found, do any of these Bauls, do they distinguish between yoga and jog, like the Sanskrit and the vernacular? Sometimes in Hindi now you'll see this for different reasons, and it's often very politicized. Oh, it's not yoga. The real yoga is yog. Yoga is what is all the postures and what the West is doing, or this sort of thing, and jog is the real thing, or whatever. There's always a kind of, or there's often an agenda behind that demarcation. But is there any conversations like that making this distinction? It sounds like jog sadhana or shodhana is something way more specific than the broader term yoga that we might think of.
Mm-hmm. It is way more specific, and honestly, in conversations that I've had, the understanding of a yoga, has really never come up. I think it might be limited to certain urban circles of Bauls and fakirs, or people who are interacting with, kind of more affluent sectors of society. They're probably aware of yoga in India. And it might also be more prevalent in West Bengal. I'll admit I've done some field work in West Bengal, but it's been more limited compared to Bangladesh in terms of the Baul communities there. And so it might be more prevalent there. But it's not something that I've come across as an important distinction. The operative word that refers to what we would think of, I think, as yoga more generally is really sadhana. It's shadhan or sadhana. Like that one, that word has kind of the connotations of a general practice to what people do. Yeah.
And I know in some of your work, you've done a lot of translation work of some of these songs. You yourself are also a musician, and I know you've learned a lot of these songs. Some of these songs, they do have kind of yogic language or idioms, metaphors from things that we might recognize from the Hatha Yoga tradition. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, no one's done like a study of how, say, the songs of one of the most famous Baul poets, Lalon Fokir, how his songs and the lyrics might interact with, say, Kabir or Surdas, some of these more well-known bhakti poets. But I can tell just from conversations, I'm not a specialist in Kabir or Surdas, but I can tell from conversations I've had with scholars of these poets that it's very clear there's a similar plane from which some of these ideas are being pulled from, or a way of communicating ideas about the yogic body and sort of subtle physiology, sort of embedded also in landscapes. And yeah, I think that a lot of it also comes from like a Vaishnava play or sense on the love between Krishna and Radha. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of that interacts together. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I can remember in Suzzalo Library, we've had a lot of conversations about
We,
that.
we have.
Well, Keith, I hate to put you on the spot, but I was wondering if maybe you would share with us one of these songs that you've learned.
Yes, I would be happy to, Seth. Yeah, sounds
Okay.
good. So I have here a dugi, which is like a small version of the left bayan of a tabla. And so it's in the lap. I don't know if you can see. There you go. And then this is an ektara, also known, it has another word, gopi jontro, so the yantra of the gopis. And let's see here.
So we've never had live music on the Yogic Studies podcast here, so this is a special treat.
Monza koro torai koro e bhobe Amun mano zono maki hobe Monza koro torai koro e bhobe Amun mano zono aki hobe Monza koro torai koro e bhobe Onontoru Srishti Kolin Shai Shuni Manoberu Tom Kitsvinai Dev Devotogon Kore Aradon Jonmo Nite Manobe Monza Koro Torai Koro E Bhobe Amun Manov Zonum Arki Hobe Monza Koro Torai Koro E Bhobe Koto Bhagye Bole Na Jani Monre Peye Tsoye Manov Toroni Bejao Torai Tori Shudarai Zeno Na Bhara Dube Monza Koro Torai Koro E Bhobe Amun Manov Zonon Arki Hobe Monza Koro Torai Koro E Bhobe মানুষে হবে মাধুর্য ভজন তাইতে মানব রূপ করলেন নিরঞ্জন মানুষে হবে মাধুর্য ভজন তাইতে মানব রূপ করলেন নিরঞ্জন এবার টকলে আর না দেখি কিনার লালন কই কাতর ভাবে বা টকলে আর না দেখি কিনার লালন কই কাতর ভাবে মন যা করো তোরাই করো এই ভবে এমন মানুষ জন্য মার কি হবে মন যা করো তোরাই করো এই ভবে এমন মানব জন্য মার কি হবে মন যা করো তোরাই করো এই ভবে এমন মানব জন্য মার কি হবে মন যা করো তোরাই করো এই ভবে
Amazing. Thank you so much, Keith. Tell us a little bit about what you sang there. I could make out a few words.
Sure.
Definitely heard some lalon.
Yeah. So it's will this human birth, amon manav janam, again occur? So will this human birth again occur? O heart of mine, act quickly while here in this world. And then the first verse is about this limitless form, Anantarup, that was created by Shai or Sai, which relates to Swami, right? As Shai, like the Lord, kind of, or the divine, because it can not just be male, it can also be female, right? It can be kind of beyond gender, this notion of Shai. But then it says, nothing is better than humankind, right? And gods and goddesses, devas and devatas pray to receive a human birth. And then the second verse is kind of how many fruits of fortune to have received this human boat. So there's a lot of metaphors about the human body as this boat that's kind of sailing along life. And so it's like quickly sail, but in this flow, make sure that you don't sink, right? And then, oh heart of mine, whatever you do, do it quickly in this world. And then the last verse is really interesting, I think, for the sake of bhakti and the connection of yoga there, where we have in humankind, in this manusha, which can be sort of the individual human or sort of collective humanity, right, will arise this sweet offering, literally like a sweet bhajana. And for this, Niranjan sort of gave or crafted this human form. And so then Lalon here at the end, which often at the end you have Lalon's bhanita or signature. And Lalon is saying, if I'm tricked, then I'm not going to see the riverbank, basically the shore. So, he's crying earnestly, like, I don't want to be deceived. I want to find kind of the true way here. And then it goes back to, will this human birth again occur? So
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So you went to Bangladesh to become a politician, or to develop a career in politics.
Yeah.
You got totally blasted open by the Bauls and by this rich tradition, and you came back to UW. And did you come back then kind of deciding you wanted to study religion, you wanted to study this tradition? How did then kind of the grad school journey kind of begin from there?
It's a great question, and it loops us back to where we were at the beginning. I didn't know exactly where this would take me. I was kind of in between, on the fence. And then, our mutual professor, Richard Solomon, after sort of meeting him, and, I was telling him about this experience, as his late wife, Carol Solomon, was a famous Baul researcher. And, I was excited to tell him about all of these things when we first met, at this departmental meeting. And it was really funny because, he was obviously interested from the perspective of a human being, but from the perspective of an academic, he was pretty much like, well, are you going to study Sanskrit? Because if you're not going to study Sanskrit, then okay, great.
Yeah, what are we doing here?
What are we talking about, right?
If you're not going to study ancient Koroshti, the oldest Buddhist manuscripts, then we don't have much common ground here, right?
Exactly.
No, that's not true. That's not true, actually.
Yeah.
He's such a brilliant scholar, and so much breadth to his knowledge, right?
So brilliant, and such a warm and loving heart, and wonderful human being. But in the right way, it kind of tested me, right? It challenged me where, if I really want to grow as a human being, I can't simply be stuck in just the Bengali worlds, because to be fair, there's a much even richer history, both outside and interpenetrating with these Bengali and other Indic, vernacular and classical languages as well. And so that challenged me, and that's where we met. And really, when I saw that people could have a career out of studying something like Sanskrit, or studying the humanities, studying some of these topics that I was interested in from, as a fan, or as a hobby, or as a personal interest, seeing how people could really devote their lives to understanding this more and to being a part of that, it provoked a kind of change in me where I was like, well, why can't I do that too? No one ever told me growing up that this was possible. So, yeah.
You caught the bug.
Caught the bug.
Yep. And then, yeah, so our time at UW ended, we moved on, and you went on to do a PhD at UC Santa Barbara, and which you've just recently finished your dissertation on a fascinating and lesser-known figure of early modern yoga in India, Swami Sabhapati Swami.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us a little bit about this project. Who is Sabhapati Swami? And I'm curious, actually, how did this project land in your lap? There's a lot of different directions that Keith Cantú could have gone for dissertation work. You have a lot of different academic interests that always seem to kind of collide together in the projects and the figures that you're working on. And I think that will be highlighted in this course.
Absolutely.
So tell us a little bit about the Sabhapati and the PhD work that you've recently completed at UC Santa Barbara.
Mm-hmm. So Sabhapati Swami, or in Tamil Sabhapati Swamigal, with this sort of gal, this kind of reverent affix to the name. He, as you say, is a lesser known figure, but I would say more the fact that he's lesser known is more of an accident of history, kind of being occluded by much more famous figures like, say, Swami Vivekananda, right, who are much more well known. But as you go into sort of the milieu of yoga in the 19th century, it was really kind of still an open world for a lot of these figures like Sabhapati, who could kind of merge different, I would say, Tamil, in the case of Sabhapati, Tamil kind of vernacular language worlds, and also the tradition that he was a part of, which you know very well as the Virashaivas, this tradition that was also in Tamil Nadu, and had been well established by the time Sabhapati was writing.
What time frame are we in here? What are Sabhapati's years?
So he was born. I'm claiming in the dissertation that he was born around 1828. Most English publications will put it at 1840, but we're talking basically 19th century. And there's evidence that he was born earlier than that, and including in a Tamil account of his life that no one has really researched prior to this project. So we're talking 19th century where, these streams were coming together, in the context of colonial modernity, railroads, print culture, and you had a desire of a kind of a yogi like Sabhapati to also spread the message outside of Tamil Nadu, outside of these, Tamil Virashaiva contexts, if we call it that, and to sort of more of a wider kind of pan-Indian audience, and at the same time his ideas were picked up by not just authors writing in India but also international authors, the founders of the Theosophical Society, and also Aleister Crowley, sort of the infamous occultist. So
one of the unique among many things about Sabhapati, as your work shows, is his bilingual or his panlingualism. How many languages he was able to write in, the translinguistic kind of nature of his project, which I think threw you some curveballs probably as you began the project, kind of realizing the different languages that you would then have to study to be able to take on his life's work. So what languages was he writing in, and why did he write in these different languages? Was it a part of this project, as you said, of taking these more localized teachings and wanting to spread them to different audiences? And that's pretty early in the 1830s, 40s to have been doing that about these topics. So tell us, a little bit about his languages.
Yeah, so I mean, in one of his Tamil hagiographies, it says that he was brought up, and that even in his youth, he had already kind of known 6 languages, and I think that points to him kind of. There is an account of him being born to a family from the Deccan, so that could mean anywhere from Maharashtra to Karnataka, to Andhra Pradesh, from coming from that kind of background, but settled in Madras and born in Velachery, a village outside of Chennai. And I think that he was sort of grown up around languages and, educated early at this missionary school in which he was exposed to English and, the Bible from an early age. I think that, even though he went on to kind of challenge that a little bit and sort of, make a turn towards what he would frame as kind of Hindu Vedanta, or, Raja Yoga. What was interesting is that he kind of took this knowledge of a multilingual world to heart, if you will, and realized, I think, very early that in order to spread this message, he would have to operate in sort of linguistic paradigms that people would understand outside of Tamil Nadu. And for him, the top priority was definitely kind of a pan-Indian focus. And I think a lot of people forget that, English is every bit as much of a pan-Indian language as it is, a colonial or, kind of international language, if we go that route. And so I think he was using English initially with all of these Sanskrit terms, but then he realized that a lot of people then didn't speak English. And so then you had to kind of localize it further and publish works. There's a Bengali translation. There's a work in kind of a Hindustani, a very Sanskritic form of Hindustani, kind of an early Hindi. There's a pamphlet that survives in Urdu. There's, Tamil. There's evidence that it was published in Telugu. So I think that because of these languages...
was he being translated
early on? I think that they were being translated by followers, but then they were also translated by a single person is possibly not entirely accurate in all cases. I think there was a lot of collaboration with Sabhapati and an attempt to kind of get a lot of the terms sort of relocalized, if that makes sense, in the original languages. Yeah. Or the relevant languages. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about his yoga. What kind of yoga did he teach? What do we find in his writings? You mentioned that he's kind of a lesser known figure, sort of just due to the circumstances of history. But I imagine most kind of yogis today, they probably have not heard of him or his yoga teachings. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about Sabhapati's yoga.
Yeah, so he really, I think, most articulately frames 3 branches of yoga. Hatha Yoga, and then Hatha Raja Yoga, and then Śivarājayoga. And so these 3 types are kind of salient throughout, especially his later works in Tamil, which make it clear, but they're also there in his earliest lectures in English. And I think that he frames, he prefers to frame Hatha Yoga as the binding of the breath, or Shvasa, and then he frames Raja Yoga as the binding of the breath and the mind, so you add manas. And then Śivarājayoga is this sort of binding or formulation of gnosis or jnana. So there's a connection of jnana with Śivarājayoga. And for him, this makes the other yogas kind of automatically sort of come about or happen. And the practice of Śivarājayoga is really predicated on basically calling to mind, whether that's visualizing or reciting mantras or sort of declaring that there are different parts of the yogic body that are there. He frames them as chakras or kingdoms or kamalas, lotuses. There's different terminology used, but there's basically different chakras. And the idea is to basically claim them or inscribe them, but then you refute them as not part of you, as not your real self. And so kind of the whole process is of inscribing this and then canceling out these parts of you. and then sort of raising this akasha. So it's not necessarily for him kundalini, this idea that rises. It's, even though that might be there, it's compared to a serpent. What really rises for Sabhapati is akasha, or jnana akasha, prana akasha, this sort of pranic ether of sorts, if we translate it that way, as he did, where you have this kind of moving along what he called a rocky pole, or like the central channel, and there's a lot of movement there, but it's predicated on this cancellation of an elaborate cosmology that's linked to the body.
And I know in your research you've done quite a bit of field work in South India, and you've found in murtis and temples living, I don't know if descendants are the right word, but there are people who celebrate him to this day. Tell us a little bit about that and your field work, and what that was like kind of on the ground. You're researching this historical figure, and then you're getting to encounter kind of his living embodiment in these different places. There's also like, he tells his biography, right, in some of his works, and you're going and visiting some of these pilgrimage places, right?
Yeah, he left a trail. In some cases, I mean, his works are known for elaborate visual diagrams. So, in many cases, there's almost like maps of sorts, that you could sort of argue with different place names. And so going to kind of trace some of these places back, including one description that he gives of instructions, how if you want to meet Sabhapati Swami, take the train and get off at Konur railway station, outside of Chennai, and then go and you'll pass this temple to Vishnu or Perumal, and there's Sabhapati Swami right there, and you can meet him and buy his books and other things like that. And so I kind of followed this description and was able to find there is the remnants of a temple, and there is a Shivalinga there that's celebrated or offered puja to as Sabhapati Swami's jiva-camātis, or sort of his tumulus or place of resting, right, where many of these siddhas are buried instead of cremated, as is more typical in Hinduism. So, this place is celebrated. There is some historical concerns about this that I go over in the dissertation.
Well,
but
let me interrupt you for a second. When he's writing that, is he writing in the present tense? Like, as he's living, saying to an audience, people can come visit me alive, or he's writing this as instructions to future disciples that they can visit him kind of post-mortem?
It's the first part. So this is when he's still alive. He's giving instructions on how you can meet Sabhapati Swami.
It's almost like an early form of, I don't know if advertising is the right word, but he's, through his publications, he's interacting with an audience and telling his place of residence, come meet me.
Exactly. That's exactly what he's doing.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. And sorry, though, I cut you off. You were talking about some of the historical challenges with some of this.
Yeah. I think that what's interesting is that Sabhapati's students, right, are listed also in his book. And so I was able to trace that and relatively conclusively determine that this was indeed the site of one of Sabhapati Swami's, he called them maṭālayams, which is basically a Sanskrit form of mata plus alaya, so like a place where this yoga was practiced. And, the line is pretty clear there in terms of sort of Sabhapati's current devotees and sort of the trustees and managers of this shrine. And today, I mean, they have a WhatsApp group. They really love, I had met one Hariharan Swamigal who unfortunately is no longer with us. He died a couple years ago after we met. But he made sure that I sent him this picture of Sabhapati Swami that I had found in his books. And then, that then led to an artist making a big painting of Sabhapati Swami that's now in the shrine. And so now, it's attracted a lot more followers as well. And, women, men, they hold events, dances, all kinds of things at this meditation hall. So that was really interesting to see and interact and watch it kind of grow as kind of awareness of Sabhapati Swami grew as well, because there were some challenges after Sabhapati's death and then after his student's death in terms of kind of the political reality of this maṭālayam, who owns the land, where does it go? And then there were thieves who had broken in and stolen a lot of the books, and materials. So all kinds of things like that had transpired since then. So.
And did you tell them, the nature of your project, and what did they think, that here was this foreigner who'd come all the way over here and he's doing, this research project on, I don't know, maybe their spiritual master or Sabhapati Swami? What did they think about your work and your questions?
Yeah, I think at first, naturally pretty skeptical, in terms of, okay, well, what is my real interest here, and then at first, especially I have to credit Vinayagam, Hariharan's son, because Vinayagam and I met on numerous occasions, and he basically, ushered in this kind of welcome for me at this meditation hall. And I remember very clearly on a Śivarājayogā night, my son and I were there, and we were invited to kind of come to the front and give this puja to the Shivalinga that's associated with Sabhapati Swami. And it was a very special event, and a very kind of honoring event of the work that scholars that like you and me, and the role that we can play in kind of, responsibly excavating some of this material that's kind of been, tucked away throughout the centuries, and there's a lot of importance to that's recognized. And Vinayagam was also really interested in the publications, and these books that, no one, sorry about the sound, no one knew had survived, at some of these libraries. So there's also that aspect of it. If a source is forgotten, then the rediscovery of a source also, can be celebrated too. So, yeah.
So it's your dissertation is fantastic. I'm still working my way through it. There's so much material. I know you're going to be publishing some of the collected works and translations of Sabhapati Swami.
Mm-hmm.
What were maybe some surprises for you along the way, maybe that came out in your field work or maybe during the writing stage? Did you kind of go into, maybe earlier on you had some assumptions maybe about Sabhapati, about his writings, or about the project? I don't know. I'm just curious, did anything kind of surprise you along the way, challenge you? Did you end up somewhere that maybe you didn't think that you were going with that project?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that initially, all I knew, and, this goes back to one of your earlier questions, was how did I come across Sabhapati Swami? All I knew is that he was this yogi who was mentioned in works on magic by Aleister Crowley. That's how I came across this figure and in conversations with people. And what I soon realized in kind of looking up the scholarship on this figure, Sabhapati Swami, I realized that really only his English lectures published in 1880 and kind of in reprint sense were the source that was being engaged. And even these occultists like the Theosophists and later on others, they were only aware of this as a source too. And so the biggest surprise for me was kind of tracing back. There is a reference to him publishing another work in Tamil, and kind of tracing this kind of textual thread back, and realizing that this English work on Vedanta and Raja Yoga is only the tip of an iceberg. And if we're going to think of it as, Vedanta and Raja Yoga even, that's only the tip of an iceberg, because as you know, this is a vast subject, a scholarly field in and of itself. And so what I quickly realized as I came across especially some of these Tamil extant sources in the Adyar library and elsewhere, that, wow, I have to learn Tamil now. And so that was really a big surprise and a push, in a direction that I did not foresee at all. And I would say a related push is that I did not foresee as direct of a relationship between Sabhapati Swami and the Tamil Siddha tradition, mm-hmm. or Sittar. And that became a little more clear too as I continued to work.
Mm. Why One more question on this, and then we'll move on to the upcoming course. But why do you think he's sort of in some ways a forgotten or lesser known figure compared to, if we look at early histories of yoga in India, we have Vivekananda and I don't know, Dayananda Saraswati and other figures who scholars like Elizabeth Day Michaelis or Mark Singleton or others who have been the primary focus kind of to date on those early during these periods. What reasons kind of account for his neglect?
I think there's two answers to that question that become fairly obvious the more you dive into this material. And one of the answers is linked to why he's forgotten in India itself. For the most part, although except for these pockets, right, of shrines and temples that we talked about. And an answer to that, I think, would be that he was writing at a unique time and celebrating really a Sanskrit foundation of yoga at a time in which there was basically the beginnings of a Dravidian language movement. And what ended up happening is a celebration of Tamil identity kind of apart from Sanskrit. And so Sabhapati's works, I think, as the 20th century went on, became really old-fashioned, for lack of a better word. They kind of were not so relevant to most people, because they were trying to move the language away from a Sanskrit foundation, which, Sabhapati's works are full of Sanskrit, or you could say Manipravalam, this kind of hybrid Sanskrit and Tamil language. And so, I think that's one reason. They sort of became archaic in a way, right? And not so relevant, whereas Vivekananda's works, I think, were more successful in kind of reaching, a broader public and remaining relevant, possibly too because of his recourse to kind of scientific theories of the time and all of these things as well. So I think that's one answer. And the second answer, in terms of more broadly, I think is that there has been historically a lack of engagement with works by authors of esotericism or occultism in terms of the sources that they engaged. And I think that's because of, kind of a surface level knee-jerk reaction that their sources or their teachings on yoga are inauthentic, they're shallow, they're only dealing with, maybe a few authors who just kind of, we're all westernized anyways, or, it's kind of just this, circle feedback loop, right? And so I think because there's a neglect to sort of take their engagement, for what it's worth, it's problematic, of course, but to take it seriously from an academic point of view or like a history of ideas point of view really allows one to say, okay, well, wait, there were other sources that were happening. They are an important record, just like, say, the missionaries, of colonial India. It's an important record of engagement with the sources that were around at that time. And so I think that it's tied to that. The neglect of really serious scholarly engagement with the esoteric milieu kind of has led to also a lack of certain aspects of modern yoga and kind of how that can relate to the contemporary world too. So,
well, it's a perfect segue into talking about the upcoming online course that you're going to teach for us here at Yogic Studies. It's going to be the first course of the new year of 2022. And awesome. The course is,
Happy New Year.
The course is entitled Yoga and Esotericism. I know we tossed around some different ideas for titles. There was different ways to kind of structure, to categorize, to kind of think about the work that you do. And a lot of the subjects that we've been talking about tonight and thinking about a course that would hopefully appeal to many, but that would also be able to kind of be an umbrella in some ways to kind of catch a lot of what we're talking about. So tell us a little bit about yoga and esotericism. I mean, how do you understand this term and this field of study, and kind of what is the relation relationship between esotericism and yoga as you understand it?
Both very excellent questions. I am approaching kind of the word esotericism more etymologically speaking, where we're having kind of eso as somewhat similar to, say, like the Sanskrit antar or antara, sort of an inner understanding or significance of what things might mean in terms of symbols and ideas. At the same time, I fully recognize, and as we'll go through in this course, that the category of esotericism itself has kind of an academic genealogy, a history itself as a field, in some ways linked to Western esotericism, right? And there have been debates over, well, what is really Western about esotericism? Can esotericism be independent or be extant outside of, say, categorizations of West and East, or Orientalism, or Occidentalism, outside of colonial power structures as well? What is the use of talking about esotericism independently? And so all of these questions are things that we will explore in the course. Alongside, though, the establishment of esotericism as specifically tied to yoga in scholarship today. I mean, if you look at, say, you brought up De Michelis's work, the subtitle is Patanjali and Western Esotericism. So it's clear that, from its very inception, even if, the histories change based on the knowledge that we obtain, through fieldwork and scholarship, even if the narrative changes slightly based on new figures that come to light, it's still very clear, even in De Michelis's writings, that modern yoga is inextricably intertwined with notions of esotericism, however we're going to define or problematize it.
I think in popular culture, colloquially speaking, the word esoteric is used for something that's either like really niche, or something that's mysterious or kind of misunderstood or far out or even kind of secretive. How does that kind of popular understanding of esotericism kind of fit with the way that you understand and use the term, and particularly, again, in relationship to yoga and to the yoga traditions?
Absolutely. I think that the term esoteric can have these connotations of something that's sort of far out and mysterious and inward. But if we're going to look at it in combination with its opposite, say exoteric, right? We also are thinking of terms of public versus private, right? Public as exoteric and private as esoteric. And what we have in terms of the connotations of a term like esoteric is that there are words, there are sayings, there are teachings, and there's a literalist interpretation of a teaching, but then there's also an inner interpretation of the teaching that's reserved or that's only practiced or that's believed by a certain group or a certain sect or a certain sort of stream or current of teachings. And I think that's where we kind of get into yoga, and circling back to some of these, Baul Fukiri songs as an example, right? There's mention of, say, Allah, or terms and names that would be known to an Islamic audience. But the ways in which these terms and ideas are used are not in necessarily a public sense, a literalist sense. And so if we're only looking at it as an exoteric teaching, then we're missing really kind of what's going on behind the word and how it's being used. And so I think that how I prefer to relate esotericism to yoga is as a hermeneutical device, a way in which we can kind of look at teachings and ideas and obtain new meanings that may otherwise be ignored if we're going to be just stuck in terms of the public, social, or political relevance, which is there in esotericism. It's just in relation to it, right? And so we can't forget really about the relationship between the two.
Is all yoga esoteric?
Absolutely not. I mean, because then the moment you say yoga is all esoteric, then we're going to say that it has no public social, trappings if we're going to be pessimistic, or if we're going to be more optimistic, it has no economic, mainstream value, that's accessible, which I don't believe at all. I think there's a lot to yoga that is extremely accessible, that can be even extremely literal, like, sit in this posture and, breathe a certain way, which is more exoteric, right? But if we're going to talk about yoga in terms of, what is the mind, right? Or what is the thought stuff? What is chitta? I think we're already getting into kind of some sort of esoteric territory, because it's not necessarily so literal or obvious what these terms are.
I think sometimes there's a tendency in these kind of discourses then to kind of default to the inner and outer truth claims, and discourses around authenticity, as you've written about it, as we've discussed in conversations before. This is certainly something that's really prevalent, I think, in the yoga world today. Discussions, arguments, debates, discourse around what is an authentic yoga, what is not. I can see easily how the language of esotericism and exotericism might fall into that kind of a black and white thinking of there's an inner or real or true or authentic yoga, and that might not be what's being presented publicly. But if we dig deep enough, if we go back to India, if we go back to the source, then we'll find that kind of true, that pure, that original, maybe even that esoteric yoga. What say you to
what
that?
Say I? Well, I refer the reader, and we'll read part of this in the course, to a chapter that I wrote on sort of esotericism and kind of new perspectives on it. And it's don't take any wooden nickels, right? This idea of yoga and cultural authenticity. And in that, I think there are two threads that we can really distinguish. And I think that there's a traditionalist interpretation where you have this idea of yoga, or as esotericism, as linked to some traditional path that is the most authentic path. Whereas we also have kind of a counter pole to that, you could argue, which is that, what about how yoga changes and evolves and develops? What can be innovative about yoga? What has changed, with interactions with other religions, with other paths, with other language worlds, right? And I think we often see a tension between those two, and the temptation is to really kind of favor, I think, in a lot of yogic discourse, as favor the original, what we perceive as independent of the change, independent of the innovation. But if we're going to really be honest with ourselves, then we have to kind of see them both in a dialectic, I think, in conversation with each other. I don't think that it serves scholarship or even a practice well to only choose one and say that that's the only way it has to be.
Well, and where is that original moment of yoga? Is it the moment of codification in a text? Is it in the performance or even sculpture of a particular asana? When we lift up the hood of those texts and sculptures, we see all the different influences and confluences that came into that. We look at the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Okay, yes, it's this Brahminical, Sanskritic, philosophical text, but then we start to see the prevalence of Buddhism and Jainism and these Shramana ideas. And the more and more you look at it, the less and less Hindu and Brahminical it starts looking, right? So, yeah, we have to be careful about clinging too hard to those singular truth claims. And at the same time, we don't have to deny that Patanjali was systematizing something concrete, We don't have to throw that out either, but we can be honest about the constant of change and confluence, right? That goes into any human endeavor and tradition, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. So tell us a little bit more then about this course and what students can expect. It's going to be a 4-week course, so 4 modules. So yeah, maybe give us a little bit more of a preview as we kind of round out the episode here.
True. Okay. Well, if you had any strong feelings, speaking now to the audience of this podcast, if you had any strong feelings or ideas about what we just talked about, then you will love the first module of this course, which is all about kind of setting the stage for these kinds of questions: yoga, esotericism, and authenticity, kind of how to define West and East, how these questions are important to, discussions of modern yoga, Orientalism or Orientalisms, as we can also see and argue. And we're also going to talk about kind of the authorial and poetic engagement with yoga and how that led to really kind of, I would say, new terminologies in, the modern, talking from 18th to the present, 18th century to the present day, led to new models of talking about yoga, new terminologies, right? In terms of how some of these authors on yoga would bring in new ideas from, say, the scientific literature of their period, or would bring in ideas from Islamic esotericism, and then kind of frame yoga in comparison with new ideas. And we'll talk about Aghihananda Bharati and the pizza effect, and kind of how this idea of pizza being exported then leads to authors writing about yoga in a certain way that might be different from this original yoga that we were talking about earlier. And so that'll be the first module to really kind of open up the field, so to speak, for these kinds of questions as we go forward. And the second module will go into, I think, what will be interesting to a lot of the students, which is the framing of an esoteric form of practice from the perspective of South Asian poets and musicians. And so I think a lot of times we can assume, esotericism must be a projection of, say, European or, colonial authors onto yoga or onto, certain strands of thought. But here what we have is kind of a local tradition that arises in the two Bengals that really tries to blend Islamic teachings on kind of the Sufi body and subtle physiology and angels and so on with traditions of yoga. And so that'll be very interesting, I think, to kind of look at how that changes our ideas of yoga, how that kind of also became socially relevant when we're talking about yoga as not necessarily tethered to a single religion, but also as a human phenomenon, as is evident in the poetry of Rabindranath Tagore and later the beat poets. So we'll kind of talk about that a little bit, the relevance of esotericism in that module as well. And in the third module, we're going to talk a little bit about Indian Theosophical Yoga. So in that strand, we'll switch a little bit to the way that authors like Sri Chandra Boshu, Rama Prasad, later Talapragada Subbarao, how in their writings they came across theosophy, they interpret it in certain ways that in some ways were the same as the theosophical founders, Helena Blavatsky and Henry Olcott, but in some ways were very different from them and kind of putting their own spin based on their experience of yogis in India, based on their experience of certain traditions and techniques of yoga. And so in this work, we want to really in this module, we want to give voice to some of these authors who are writing from the perspective of Indian theosophy, but really have their own perspective on it, perspectives to share on it. And
that's really interesting. Sorry to interject, but
no, of course.
We hear so much about theosophy, and people know the names, maybe Madame Blavatsky or Henry Olcott. but we don't hear as much about, or they're not as loud, the Indian theosophical voices that were hugely influential in translation projects, even of key works of Hatha Yoga that then disseminated globally. And so that's going to be a really, I mean, all of these modules are so rich and fascinating, but I think that's another kind of special thing to dig into. So yeah, keep going.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's extremely relevant. I agree. And then in this last module, we will focus to kind of the magical reframing of yoga and center it on Sri Sabhapati Swami in particular, because I think he really serves as one of the best case examples of how yoga could be interpreted as a practice of magic, not necessarily as like a stage magic or as a kind of any kind of fanciful fairy tale, although of course there's relationships between all of those as well. But we're talking about kind of yoga as a sort of serious meditative and inward practice that relates to, popular topics like astral projection and subtle bodies and ideas about, methods of realization and attainment that might have been unrelated to yoga, prior to the 19th century, but then kind of slowly become mapped on to yoga as a system of thought. And really, there's no way to separate them in a contemporary context, because it's all kind of part of what yoga is today. So I think that's an interesting, an interesting way we'll go into in terms of how we can, I would say, both on the one hand stress the contributions of outside authors writing about yoga, and yogis then who were also adopting this terminology, say as, evident by some of the publications of latent light culture and others. So the Kalpaka was a journal that was circulating in South India that was also engaging literature on quote-unquote magic, that then was reframing yoga in this very pizza effect kind of way for an educated Indian audience. So we kind of see really how it's intertwined. Yeah.
All right. Well, that was a fantastic overview. We can't give it all away, of course. We'll keep some of the esoteric private and hidden for now.
There you go, hidden away.
But if any of these topics are of interest to you, if you want to dive into all of these different traditions and just to see how they weave together and their interconnections, we invite you to join us. The course is going to run live from January 3rd through 28th, 2022. So again, this will be the first course of the new year. And I'm really excited to host you, Keith. It's been just an awesome pleasure to have you here and to get to connect on the podcast in this way. Thank you again for sharing not only your story, your research, but also your music and a little bit of that Baul bhav, or what is it in Bangla?
Bhav. You got it right, bhav.
Yeah. Any final thoughts or reflections kind of as we close things off here?
Yeah, well, first of all, if I can respond, thank you so much for having me and for the opportunity. It's a wonderful honor to be a part of the Yogic Studies platform. It's going to be a fantastic course, I imagine, and I really want and encourage any of you who might be interested to sign up to really approach these topics, with as open a mind as possible, and to really come to the course and the content of the course with fresh questions that maybe I have never thought of, that maybe you have, you or your friends haven't thought of but are only sort of just starting to have, as I think that that's what really can drive this exchange further and, help us understand this very complex topic, on the one hand, while on the other hand it can be, kind of so simple in terms of what we think of, esotericism, it can be. And so I think that as we navigate some of the topics in this course, I really want to be sensitive and mindful of your own impressions and your own ideas. And I really am excited to engage with you on your own thoughts and impressions of kind of how this material fits together and interweaves with your own life.
All right. With that, thank you, Keith. Thank you to all of our listeners and to now our viewers on YouTube. Please don't forget to subscribe on your podcast feeds. Leave us a review on iTunes. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, the like button. Leave us a comment or a question. Let us know what you thought of this episode. I'm sure Keith and I would both love to respond to those comments. So with that, we'll bid everyone adieu and hope to see a lot of you in the upcoming course to ring in the new year. So thanks again to Keith. I know we'll be in touch soon, my friend. Maybe we'll even see each other in person in Kraków.
Hope so. Yeah.
We'll see what fate has for us. But until next time, please everybody take care, and we'll see you again soon.